Hmm. Well, there's a wider panoramic view than I think I've had before in my camera. I still need to get a new camera at some point. Hello, everyone. This is Kestrel Raptorial. In the first video that I titled The American Kestrel Show, my episode 1, The Hope of the 2000s to the Insanity of the 2010s, and I suppose now the beginning of the 2020s. In that video, I talked about how bright and creative and enjoyable things seemed at the turn of the millennium, and the depressing feel of where the state of the world is now. And it does often boggle my mind how it all happened. There was a series of events and sabotage that brought things to where they are now, and the more I learn about how that path has played out over time, it began well over 100 years ago, the more angry I am that the threat, which should have been known about by our elders, since it's happened before in the world, was not taught to my generation, the millennials, as we were growing up, and what to do to shield ourselves, our families, and our civilization from it. The knowledge should have been passed down. In the new city that I'm living in for my work, I will not tell you which one it is, because there's eyes and ears from the communists everywhere, though don't worry, I'm still living in the USA. I feel a duty to stay here and not move to a more stable country right now. There aren't a whole lot of them anymore. Poland and Russia, it seems now, since they've returned to their Orthodox Christianity and creating large, stable families again, which is what I've argued that the USA needs to go back to, that all the Western countries need to go back to. Russia is a very interesting and unique blend of Western civilization and I suppose a bit of the Far East. A lot of the first, I guess, original Russians, the ancestors of those today, descended from Vikings. Very interesting. I need to try and keep some small level of stability and American productivity that we still have. That's why I am working as a machinist now, even though I wanted to be an ecologist, but the sciences the natural sciences didn't exactly kick me out, but I wasn't able to find a paying job through, I guess, conventional means, if it can call it that anymore, more like communist means now, um, because I would not play. I actively refused to play the to go along with the whole woke culture. I absolutely refused, and I continue to refuse, even though it costs me the profession I wanted to go into. Although I might find my own way of getting into that, of doing some ecology. That will have to wait a little bit. This past weekend, actually 2 weekends ago now, I went and spoke to a Catholic church to talk to them about the potential of joining, which as a little kid in the 90s, I never would have dreamed I'd do. When I was growing up, the huge debate, clash really, of evolution versus creationism was well known throughout the schools, and I was firmly on the side of evolution, having loved reading about it since I was even smaller, since I was about 4 or 5 years old, actually. I used to go into the nonfiction corners, sections of the libraries when I was that little, like 4 or 5, and just read all the natural science books. I found it absolutely fascinating reading. I would also have some lengthy conversations and at times confrontations with creationist Christians who the pastor that or father, I'm still not clear on all the differences. I've only started looking into it in the Catholic Church, but the person I spoke with did inform me and really backed up, was able to back up with evidence and stories that the creationist Christians were really a little more on the extreme side. Uh, not true extremists, but pushing it further than a lot were willing to. In that whole clash and evolution, people who loved evolution just would not budge, including me. I still won't budge. But what's important is really the keeping of a stable family, and if Christian values are the way to do that, I'm coming to a place where I'm all for it. And the whole creationist versus evolution conflict seems laughably gentle now compared to the Marxist disintegrationist reach to overthrow the constitutional republic of reason and free enterprise that the United States of America stood for since achieving its independence in 1776. I was, and still am, a late 1980s baby, 1990s kid, and turn of the millennium teenager. I was quite young in my teens when 1999 turned to 2000, and all the rage that summer. I think the summer of '99 was Disney's Tarzan, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and was it Pokemon 2000? Yeah, I think that came out in summer 1999. It was called Pokemon 2000 because it was soon to be the beginning of the year 2000. That was an amazing summer. It really was. Even for me, when I was often ill and lacking in energy as a teenager, as a child and teenager, actually, it lasted obnoxiously long. I still had a great time that summer, and it really did seem like the world was, at least in North America. I know in other countries now that it was a very different story, but in North America, at least, it did seem like it was really the onset of a golden age of creativity, and now it's a complete shit show, and even the shit is burning. Countries, not only in the West but around the world, are in turmoil so bad that you when I was a kid, patriotic American songs and the Pledge of Allegiance were sang and recited in almost every public school in America proudly. Now, you do either of those and you're bludgeoned to death by the Antifa mob and branded a counter-revolutionary terrorist. I mean, I'll still do those, and I still have my pocket constitution, but it's scary the way things are, the way patriotism is shamed today. And only by standing firm against that shaming, saying, I will not feel ashamed, can you really repel it. How do we make sense of what has been happening? Well, to the well-reasoned mind, it of course still makes zero sense. But to explain how it happened, we need to go back to the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 1800s, when the beginnings of free enterprise industry was really showing promise in being able to replace slave labor. And of course, going to be a much better source of labor than slavery, despite working conditions for employees still being very rough for quite a few decades. Or at least you would be paid for your at least you would be paid for your labor and could raise a family even though working conditions were not very good. And you could trust that you would not be sold off at any point by your employer. This is why free enterprise is far better than slavery, and it had a huge, and its expansion had a huge hand in the abolition of slavery. A lot of people believe that there were never any white slaves in British and later independent America. That's not true. I myself have ancestors, some of them the first of my ancestors to make the crossing from Europe into North America, who came as what was called indentured servants. These were poor people who literally sold off everything they had and even themselves into servitude to purchase their way across the Atlantic Ocean into early America. When the Native Americans were here, they didn't call it America. I'm not. Each and every clan and tribe had their own name, but even before it was the independent United States of America, the uh, the European immigrants, who were very different than the immigrants coming today, that the government is being allowed to come in droves, only stopped with this coronavirus shutdown, which is not being handled anymore responsibly. We'll get into that. When these European, uh, I guess you could call them, well, they were fleeing. They were fleeing persecution from very early on a lot of the religious wars in Europe. Later, uh, some of the horrible working conditions and unjust laws in Europe, which Europe eventually got around to straightening out uh, until the disaster it is today, with the government selling out the Europeans to the Muslims. Yeah, it's in chaos today because the government sells their own people out. Governments all around the world do this. They lie to their people. They sell them out. Uh, they bury hundreds of future generations in debt that can never be paid off. I mean, government has no sense of proper resource management because they just kick the can of dealing with crises down the road over and over and over and over again. You try doing that if you're a predator living in the wild, predatory animal living in the wild. Oh well, you can. It's not possible, and ecosystems don't work that way, and economies are very much like ecosystems. I will make a video comparing them sometime, but let's get through what I have scripted for today. When these early European immigrants to early America reached the East Coast, what would happen is they would begin their lives as servants. I'm talking about the indentured servants here. A lot of my ancestors. They begin their life in the New World as in the households or businesses of masters, in the sense of masters of the house who who managed the servants, something kind of like what you would see in Downton Abbey or Umineko no Naku Koroni. Although that family has quite good relationships with their servants, interestingly. Romances with a few of them. If only that game would make the least bit of sense. So I'd like to try and play the whole thing sometime. But we're getting off topic. The one thing that separated the indentured servants from being slaves was they were not looked at as property. They were people who were in serious debt, who needed to work long and hard to pay off that debt, and were free once they did pay that debt off. So rather than their masters having to free them, they could free themselves just by paying off the debt. The problem is the debt would often be very crushing. And it could take many, many years. Now that sounds not too different from having to pay off large amounts of debt little by little each year as we know it today. But keep in mind, in the 17 and 1800s, there was no credit, debt-based economy. Being in severe debt was very serious, immediate trouble. It still is. And so it was different in some ways, as you couldn't you couldn't take out credit cards to pay back other credit cards. By the way, that's still a disaster for people who do it today, but you couldn't do it at all back then. You could take out some amount of debt, but they already had to make the crossing. Uh, the working conditions for everyone were not great unless you were a landlord or something, or the equivalent of, unless you owned unless you were a property owner. I mean, the life for soldiers, actually, particularly, must have been, still is extremely rough. Usually, it's extremely rough when you're on tour. Back then, every day must have been a real grind when you were actually fighting. It was so the state of the world and growing country that was experiencing at the time. If you look at some of the working conditions of London, of Paris, of the I guess what you would call underclass, the heavily indebted, the lowest workers, it was dirty, it was rough, it was long, it was a grind unlike many experience today. I also have ancestors who were young orphan children living in Canada after their parents died, and died quite young, by the way, in the crossing from Europe to America. Yes, direct ancestors of mine from only 6 or 7 generations ago, who lived as orphans and indentured servants, who lived extraordinary harsh lives in early America. Hardly any better than true slaves, even though they were white and could buy their own freedom after a while. And added to that, my own family history going back as many generations, or maybe many more, was full of broken families and abusive relationships. Not every relationship in the family history, but quite a lot. And I myself have, in almost every way, been completely disowned by my own family for sticking up for America and the freedom and conservative values it gave. About the most noble attempt at building that any nation in human history has ever given, even though it took some time for each step to really take off. In fact, I have been effectively disowned by my family for not submitting to woke culture. Now, they've still not said so with that blunt directness, but they had to talk to me as such in every way, so I get the message. Only my dad and younger brother still speak to me, treating me as a human being. Problem being, neither of them is in any position to come and join forces with me in person. In fact, I'm going to have to be the one who rescues my little brother from the woke mob, but he is currently trying to figure out if he wants to stick with his summer job for a few months longer. So, in the middle of the 1800s, free contractual agreement and enterprise industry overcame slave labor. And the whole process is a long and complex one. And some people, I'll have to talk to my phone later. Some people didn't like that, not because they loved slavery, but because they did not or were unwilling to do well in the new world of free enterprise. And one of those was the author of the Communist Doctrine, Karl Marx, one of the authors. And Stefan Molyneux, who has been banned from YouTube based on violations of hate speech policies. And we all know what that means. YouTube and other platforms have been extremely vague in their policies and have been acting as acting editors, even though they say they're just a platform, which means they're lying to the people who make accounts, the users of their edited platforms. And the Trump administration should have been on that, calling them out for it and cracking down on that really fast. I have no idea why they waited to this year to even give an attempt. It's a disaster. On the other hand, the Democrats have let rioters just run wild and have their way with the cities. So what's going to happen in November? I don't anything at this point. Anything I don't know. So if you want to see more, if you want to continue following Stefan Molyneux, he can be found on Subscribed Star. You look for Free Domain on Subscribed Star. And he does need some resource help from those who can give it. I have donated quite a bit recently, and I'm working on budgeting what money I have right now. So I have to take some time to be very careful about what I can and cannot sponsor. I'll be able to again in some time. But Stefan Molyneux recently uploaded a part-by-part reading and discussion series of videos going through the Communist Manifesto book with his daughter, which I will provide links to below in the video subscription, Subscribe Star instead of YouTube. I highly recommend them. I think those videos will be very revealing of the threat and sadism of communism. I've been talking for a while. Okay. Professor Jordan Peterson uploaded many videos of his own lectures and discussions of what happened when communism took over in Russia over a century ago, and Russia is now coming out of that, only doing so by returning to their Orthodox Christianity and deserved nationalism. I should stop trying to make videos in the really early morning hours. But I don't have much of a choice. I don't have much time. I go to work in the very early afternoon, and work lasts till 11 at night. So Jordan Peterson's discussions of what happened when communism took over in Russia and Marxist revolutionaries created the Soviet Union, which lasted for around 80 years in all, during which time hundreds of millions of people were killed by a regime far more sadistic than the Nazis, and that was in power for many decades longer than the Nazis. Yet the Nazis and not the Marxist communists were what we were told the history of and warned about throughout school. Nazis were defeated over 70 years ago. Communists have not yet been. So why was this? Why, when the nationalist socialists were defeated and the communists not, were we warned only of the dangers of extremist nationalism and racial supremacy? Why were we, in the West, throughout all of our formative years, when our parents and teachers had decades to teach and warn and prepare their children and their grandchildren of the horrors wrought by an extremist lust for unearned equality of outcome in life, which is impossible to achieve, by the way, for, among many reasons, one major one is people of the same ethnicity living within the same community. Often, even they do not have the exact same work and life priorities. Karl Marx, much like Bernie Sanders, lived his life as a lazy bum who lived entirely off of the work productivity of others, exploited his friends, family, and own country's people, all in service of what he called a vision of equal outcome for everyone, but in reality, all in service to his own hyperinflated ego. Marx never cared or provided much quality for his wife and children, Anything he did provide was worked and paid for by the labor of people that he himself did not employ or pay. That said, his friend Engels couldn't have had much sense in him. If he had, he'd have cut his ties with and funding of Marx very early on, which may have actually been good for Karl Marx had he been slapped with a cold hard slap of reality of having to change himself to earn his way in the world for once in his life. Instead, Engels kept on supporting him, which allowed Karl Marx to write the Communist doctrines, which went on to inspire and fan the flames of the most evil, sadistic, and oppressive regimes that have ever existed in human history. So, I'm talking a lot about the threat of communism, and you may ask, what is communism? What is the actual doctrine it is built on, this overwhelming threat to freedom that we keep hearing of, but aren't taught a lot of what actually is? Completely fair question. Well, this is where I would first suggest you go and watch Stefan Molyneux's videos titled The Communist Manifesto for Kids. It's in several parts that are still being made because it's a great, well-paced introduction. But put simply, it's a social belief system based on the idea that having to earn your way in life, having to earn your living, having a sense of responsibility for your own actions no matter what your status in life, all for the purpose of earning your way towards a better living and building a stronger family, is wrong to ask of people, and is only asked of you by those already in positions of power and privilege. Now, it's true that people in positions of authority over you will often expect you to have a sense of responsibility for your own actions, but a sense of responsibility of taking care of yourself and family is also a good value to hold regardless, because it disciplines you to learn self-control, which is not easy to keep to, and teaches you to have a good work ethic, which will help you to earn your way towards a better living, whether you are expected to by others or not. Communism is the socioeconomic hypothesis and structure based on this idea of transferring the means and ownership of production to workers, employees of companies other than the bosses, the supervisors, the managers, boards, and CEOs, who are the people in charge of running the companies, buying the factories, building the warehouses and facilities, and arranging things from transportation to resource allocation to taxes and payrolls, and distributing produced wealth and resources to the people, either completely equally or according to need. It has become a very popular model among people who wish the nations of the world to adopt, and even adopt on a global scale. Now, here's the problem. Well, here are some of the many problems. First, and understand this, everyone, because it's very important, the only way that could possibly be done, that transfer and redistribution of wealth could possibly be done, is by expanding and voting for the government power to do so. However, that leads to the immediate and what should be obvious problem of once the government is given that power, it keeps it within the government. The government keeps it for itself. They never give it back to the people. Not redistribute the money and or resources equality to all. The Venezuelans learned this agonizingly painful when they voted in President Hugo Chavez in 1999, who promised to take money from the rich and redistribute it to the poor, and never did. He installed himself as a communist dictator. He, his family, and his very small circle of Political friends kept all of the food and what wealth remained for themselves, and 99% of the population was reduced to starvation, regardless of race, belief, or previous standard of living. So, equality of agony and suffering. He was only killed by natural causes, only to be replaced by Nicolas Maduro, who is just as bad, if not worse. And the Venezuelans are still trying to survive by eating cats, dogs, and rats, with even those now becoming hard to find, even if there was a way of catching them. All throughout the West, we've seen gigantic numbers of people completely incompetent in the fields they claim to be authorities in, find their way into government by playing on the feelings and desires of voters for equalities of some kind, only for the people to find that their living environment only gets worse. And the politicians hold on to power by expanding government programs with promises, but never any of them kept or work out the way they are promised to. You can't deny this. And even though I'm a conservative, I'm saying this about all politicians on the left and on the right alike. The cities and communities that have been hit hardest, some burned almost entirely to the ground, ensuring that prosperity may well never return to them, are non-white communities. The government and mainstream media like to call them minority communities, even though white people have, for the first time in centuries, made up a minority in population of ethnicities in the United States as a whole. The worst ransackings took place and were allowed to run uninterrupted, unintercepted in Democrat-led cities. And so the Democrat Party is looking completely uninterested in the protection of their people's lives and safety, which they are. That is the correct conclusion. And the Republican Party is completely cowardly. And independents and libertarians have never been completely unable to gain any significant foothold, which means in a lot of ways each individual and family really is on their own. Every single government program is untrustworthy, including the coronavirus shutdown health precautions measures, for the very reason that it was a shutdown of people's lives and jobs, meaning of their way of earning a living. Why have I been so antagonistic to any of the health safety measures? Because there's too much about them that is too suspicious. And I'll expand and explain that in my next video.